Hey there, my name is Jeff Alexander, and I'm the pastor here at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. Just wanted to say thank you so much for stopping by and listening in to see what God has to say in His Word today. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about selfless love, and we're going to continue that theme today of talking about selfless love when it comes to looking at the pathways of life that we walk down. Because there's a lot of different pathways that we can choose, but there's one that is most important for us to settle on. There's one that's most important for us to consider as we begin taking this journey of life from where we are right now. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. Put my email at the bottom of the screen. You can send me a message on Facebook. You can write a comment here on the YouTube channel, and I would love to get back with you to answer those questions that you might have about selfless love. This past summer, I've had an opportunity to explore something that I've always wanted to do, and that is hiking. Not just hiking, walking up and down the streets or hiking through woods, but hiking more along the lines of like mountain hiking. Not hand over fist type of climbing, but just hiking through the woods, hiking through mountains. And I've had an opportunity to do that. Gone out and bought a couple of topographical maps so I can see the trails and how steep the inclines might be. I've learned that trick, or I've learned that lesson of seeing how steep those trails are. I've ended up going on some that were a little bit more steep than I was hoping, but made it through it. This past week, had an opportunity to go hiking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. So I went out and bought, I think it was like 4 or 5 topographical maps that cover the entire White Mountains region of New Hampshire and Maine. And I went out and hiked this past Tuesday, and I looked at the map before I went. I wasn't quite sure what to expect when I, really get there, and so I stopped off at an information booth that had a gentleman in there that I asked. I went up to him and said, "Hey, I've never hiked in the White Mountains before. What do I need to know?" And he kind of looked at me like, "There's a lot to know. Like, you're kind of crazy," which I can be. But anyways, he pointed me in the right direction, and I ended up finding the trailhead. And I looked at the map before I went, and I knew that a quarter mile in to a third of a mile in, there was going to be another trail that kind of meets up together, and then they head off up the side of the mountain, up to the top of Mount Pierce, which is where I was planning to go. And there's a couple of different directions that you can go up as you head further up the mountain. Well, at this, quarter mile in, there's the trail, 2 trails come together, and there's another family, a family of 4 that comes onto this trail, and they say, "Hey, we're heading to Mount Pierce." I was like, "That's funny because I'm heading there." And they said, "Well, which way are you going?" I was like, "Well, I'm going to go that way that you guys just came." And they kind of looked at me like, "What are you talking about?" I kind of saw that they were a little befuzzled, and I asked, "Well, what is that way?" They said, "That's a parking lot." I was like, "Well, I'm not going that way then." And so we kind of looked at the map, and we determined, there's these paths up there that are kind of split off, and which one's best for us to go down. And we kind of determined this was the best path for us to go down. In our life, there's these same pathways. There's these many different pathways that we choose, but there's the best pathway that we can walk down. Different pathways of life, but there's a best pathway that's most important for us to consider as we continue this journey. We've come down to this place where we stand today, and we've learned a lot of lessons. Some of those lessons we'll probably learn again as we continue on the journey. We'll walk some of those same paths and learn those same lessons. But we're going to look at a text today that points out that most important pathway. Because as we've seen over these past couple of months, there's different pathways in people's lives that they would say is the most important. COVID has kind of stripped away a lot of different things in our life. And so we've seen through this COVID experience that people have emphasized that sports is the most important pathway. And if you listen to how they talk, it doesn't matter if it's elementary or middle school or high school or college or professional, they would say sports is the most important pathway for me and my family to consider. And they They act in a way that puts sports as the most important pathway. There's been other experiences and other events that have taken place during COVID that have caused people to say that righting social injustices are the most important pathway for us to walk down, to right these social injustices. Or education. There's been administrators that have spent the entire summer trying to figure out what education is going to look like. Teachers have spent the entire summer thinking about what their classroom is going to look like. Families are now trying to figure out what education is looking like. With school starting this past month or the next couple of weeks, families are trying to figure this out, and this has become the most important thing on their mind. Political positions. I can just imagine 3, 6, 9 months from now, one of the sides is going to blame the other side. They already are blaming each other for what's happened in COVID, and one of the sides is going to take credit for solving COVID, and the other side is just horrible and terrible. And this is the most important pathway for us to walk down, that my side wins. Healthcare. How we get through COVID. Masks, no masks, social distancing, not social distancing. Do we gather with 10 people? Do we gather with large crowds? What is the best way for us to combat COVID? Now, please don't take what I'm saying the wrong way, because these are all important. All of these pathways, whether it be sports, righting social injustices, education, and what do we do with that? Healthcare, what do we do with that? Political positions. These are all important pathways for us to consider. But there's one that is the most important for us to keep in mind as we walk this journey of life. And that's what I want us to look at today, is that all of these other pathways should be informed by the most important pathway. And selfless love points us. It doesn't matter who we are on the journey. It doesn't matter who we are on the journey or who's journeying. Selfless love points anyone on the journey towards the most important pathway. We're going to be in Mark chapter 15, and I wanted to read beginning in verse 21. And if we look at the text, we see from the previous week, from last week, that Jesus was standing before Pilate. And he was accused of being the king of the Jews, and so through that whole circumstance, the Jews want Jesus crucified, and now Pilate agrees with them, and now Jesus is on the road, on the journey to the cross. And Mark picks up there in verse 21 and says, "And they, being the soldiers, compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry Jesus' cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him, and the inscription of the charge against him read, 'The King of the Jews.' And with him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, 'You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross.' So also the chief priest with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, 'He saves others. He can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe.' Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?' And some of the bystanders heard it and said, 'Behold, he is calling Elijah.' And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, 'Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down.' And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that it was saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." And there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, he followed him. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. And one of the things that I noticed this past week as I was studying this text and looking at it and reading through it, one of the things that seemed to just come to my attention was the number of people that were introduced in this text. I don't know if there's, in 20 verses, if the same number of people are introduced in any of the other texts. There are just a lot of different walks of life, a lot of different people that are journeying. And we see that Jesus is journeying to the cross. And the first person that we're introduced in this text is a guy by the name of Simon of Cyrene. Now, they're in Jerusalem, and Cyrene is actually on the northern coast of Africa. Go south and west and head through Egypt, and Cyrene is even further west of Egypt. And most likely, this is used as an identifier because he says, "This is Simon of Cyrene, the father of Rufus and Alexander." It's funny because Rufus and Alexander aren't mentioned in the text. This is the first time they're mentioned in the text, and they aren't mentioned at all later on in the text. Most likely, these two individuals are known by the reader. It could be that Alexander and Rufus are reading through the letter. But most likely, this is an identifier to the people that are reading the letter. Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. You know these guys. These guys are walking with you. These guys are doing the same things that you're doing. They're on the same journey that you're on, the same pathway that you're on. You rub shoulders with these guys. And Simon, he was doing his everyday normal stuff. He was coming in from the fields, and he was coming in to the city, and he sees this crowd of soldiers and a guy that's just bloody. And the soldiers grab him up and say, "You're going to carry the cross for Jesus." And he heads back out to the fields, basically. He reverses course. That's the first person that we're introduced to, is Simon, who a man who is doing his everyday stuff, going about his normal daily rhythms. The second group of people that are mentioned are the soldiers. The soldiers offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, and we're familiar with myrrh because we heard that in the birth story of Jesus. That the wise men brought gold and frankincense and myrrh was a fragrance. Myrrh was a perfume. It was an incense that was used. But it was also used in this time as a medicine, as a drug. It was used to kill the pain. It was a painkiller when they mixed it with wine together with myrrh. And what happened was that the women would give people that were heading to the crucifixion a mixture of myrrh and wine to dull the pain of the crucifixion. Here the soldiers are offering Jesus a mixture of wine and myrrh, and it's not done to show compassion on Jesus, because that's how it was taken, was a sign of compassion. But I can't imagine that the soldiers are offering Jesus wine and myrrh because they were wanting to be compassionate, because they went ahead and crucified him. They were wanting to extend out his life. They were wanting to bring it to dull his pain so that they can punish him more, so they can inflict more pain upon Jesus, so they can get that rush that they got so much from torturing individuals. And you see, they didn't have much of a regard for life. They were so numb to considering someone as more important because of their life experiences. They also looked to humiliate. They took Jesus' clothes and they cast lots. They took Jesus' possessions, and this was a common occurrence. They just took whatever was left over and they divided amongst the soldiers as kind of spoils. If you think about it, Jesus' clothes, they healed individuals. Jesus' clothes were radiant at the Mount of Transfiguration. And here they are just kind of casting lots for them. A very humbling place that Jesus has come to. These soldiers look to see what it is that they can do to humiliate as much as possible. And then a third group of people are those that are blinded by their own view. Here, these individuals in verse 29, and it doesn't really identify them. It just says that, and those who passed by derided him. They couldn't quite let go of what Jesus' claim on the temple was. Jesus claimed that in 3 days he's going to destroy the temple, and in the 3 days he was going to rebuild the temple. They didn't quite understand that Jesus was recreating a place for them to meet God, because that's what the temple was there for. It was a place where people could meet God. And what Jesus was saying is that no longer is the temple going to be a place where you meet with God, but it's going to be through me. His life that was going to be destroyed. And in 3 days it was going to be built back up so that man could have access to God. Goes on to talk about how this group of people were joined by the scribes and the high priest that despised Jesus' power. If you think back of Jesus' display of power, the man that had his withered hand healed back on the Sabbath, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and how Jesus calmed the storms and how Jesus healed the blind, and he demonstrated a great amount of power. These religious leaders, these scribes and the high priests said, Jesus, you have this power. If you have enough power to do all of the stuff that you've done, then why don't you demonstrate power? Why don't you demonstrate power and bring yourself down off the cross? But they were so blinded by what they desired. They wanted Jesus to come down to their level. Come down here and then we'll believe. They were so blinded by their own ways that they didn't quite understand and see what Jesus was doing, that Jesus was actually living out what he taught. In chapter 8, verse 35 of Mark, he says, whoever would save his life will lose it. In Mark chapter 10, verse 45, he says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. You know, Jesus was carrying out God's plan of attempting, and they were attempting to thwart God's plan. And we have these same people that walk with us on this journey. But we see that selfless love points anyone on the journey to the most important pathway. And we get to the cross and we see a response that Jesus has at the cross. That Jesus calls out and cries out and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you know, I've thought through this and I've kind of struggled over the past couple of years of just trying to understand what was going on. Because is this Jesus experiencing that is this God totally turning his back on Jesus and abandoning him? Because that's one of the ways that it's seen. That it's a total abandonment by God, turning his back on Jesus. But is this consistent with how God has pursued man? God has constantly pursued man, that man has turned his back on God, but God is the one that constantly pursues man. And I think it's best understood if we look at the psalm that Jesus took this from, Psalm 22. Because this was often viewed as a psalm that people would quote when they were in distress, when they were in trouble. My God, why have you forsaken me? And we sometimes feel that way, that we've lost all hope. And we might not say it that way, my God, why have you forsaken me? But we might say, God, why do I feel so alone? God, why is it that you aren't answering me? And we feel as if God has turned his back on us. But this psalm is very clear. If we look at verse 4, it says, if you, our fathers, trusted, in you, our fathers trusted, they trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. And if we skip down to verse 8, he says, he trusts in the Lord. The person that's being persecuted, the person that's going through trials, the person that is being mocked, trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. This is more of a psalm, a cry that Jesus is saying, Father, I trust you, and I know that you're going to rescue me. It is a cry of distress. It's a cry of Jesus seeing the effects of sin. That Jesus sees the consequences of sin. And he says, my God, this sin is so terrible, and this sin is so horrible. But yet, I trust you. I trust your plan. I trust what it is that you are going to do through my life. There's this promised hope that Jesus has. It's more of an acknowledgement by Jesus of a current status, while looking to God's promises that he will never leave him. And no doubt, people on this journey experience this grief of sin in their life. But yet, selfless love points anyone on the journey to the most important pathway. And at the end of this text that we're looking at today, in verses 40 and 41, we come to a final grouping of people. A grouping of people that, for today, they're just mentioned in these two verses. It says, there were also women looking on from a distance. And then he goes on to name these women. And in verse 41, it says, when he, Jesus, was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. I mean, if you think about it, at the foot of the cross was a group of women. When all else abandoned Jesus, when all else left Jesus, when all else turned their backs on Jesus, a group of women stood at the foot of the cross at a distance and watched what was going on. Women who in that day were seen as half citizens. They were seen as not very important. They were belittled. But yet, we see how it is that they were devoted to Jesus. We see the courage that they displayed by standing there at the foot of the cross. They didn't turn around, they didn't run, but they stood there, ready to continue to minister to Jesus. They came up to Jerusalem as those who ministered to Jesus, and they continued to do so. They were embracing ministry in the midst of trials, in the midst of tribulation, and not just enduring it. You may wonder why a group of women would stand there at the foot of the cross. It's a selfless love. It's a selfless love that's pointing them to the most important pathway on this journey. A selfless love that causes people to not give up and to be ready and faithful ministers. So as we look back at this text, we say, well, what about us? What about you? What is it in this text that we can look at and say, you know what, there's some things that I need to take away from this. Well, I think there's a few things that we can take away from this, and one is be kind. You know, we're going to get sidetracked. People that we're walking with are going to get sidetracked. And what do? Do we turn our back on them? Is that what it is that we're supposed to do and kind of say, well, you went down that pathway and I told you not to go down that pathway? Or are we to be kind to them? It does get confusing on the journey. We start walking down a pathway that looks like it's a good pathway, and we get into the middle of it and we realize, oh, it's not as good as I thought it was. You know, there's a behavior that's very that's becoming familiarly known as being a Karen or being a Chad. Being a Karen is, you can look it up online, Google it. What does being a Karen mean? I mean, it'll probably give you a lot of good descriptions of a Karen. Real briefly, a Karen is a person that lives life with an entitled mindset, and they let other people know it. Entitled in the regards of asking for a manager if you don't get your way. That's kind of a Karen. That's the Karen mindset of, well, let me see your manager then. I didn't like so-and-so. Let me see your manager. And they kind of go up the line. I want to see your supervisor. And to be honest, I don't know how many times I've said that. It's something that God's really been working on me as an individual, of being kind to other people, of not being a Karen, of not being a Chad. Because to be honest, 15, 20 years ago, that was the mindset that I had. I'm just going to go up the line. If I want something done, I'm going to go up the line. And it doesn't matter who I walk all over. It doesn't matter the pathway that they're on. We need to be kind. We get wrapped up in our daily stuff. We get wrapped up in the things that we're doing, and we have a disregard for life by our actions. We might say that we value life, but our actions demonstrate differently. We try to humiliate people in order to build ourselves up and make ourselves look better, or we're blinded by our own point of view. We are those people on the journey to the cross. Being kind is a selfless love that points others, doesn't matter who they are on the journey, it points others to the most important pathway. Because the people that are on this journey with us are looking for hope. They're looking for that most important pathway. And being kind opens the door for hope to be shared with them. Where does this hope come from? I would say that verse 38 is probably the most important of this chapter here, this section that we read in verse 38. Because if we look, verse 37 and 39, if we pulled out verse 38, verse 37 and 39 would segue very nicely. But Mark puts this in here. It's almost like we're at the cross, and then we're over here at the temple, and then we're back here at the cross. So Mark is trying to point us to something in this text. He says, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. It's kind of strange because this is a pretty tall curtain. Someone would have to stand on a ladder to rip it from the top to the bottom. It wasn't torn from the bottom to the top, but from the top to the bottom. And this is God saying that my holiness, because this curtain goes back to the tabernacle. It goes back to the temple, where it says that this is the holiest place where God resides, and everybody else is out there on the other side of the temple. But here God is ripping it in half to say that through Jesus, my holiness can be experienced for those that come to Jesus. So this is the most important pathway for us to look at all of the other pathways that we have in life. And I've been thinking about, what if we stood at the foot of the cross like those women who are courageous and who are devoted? And what would happen if we kept in mind two questions as we stand here right now and look at the most important pathway that we are going to walk down? What if we kept these two questions in our mind? If not us, then who? If we see something going on, an injustice going on, if we see something that's not right in our community and we just turn a blind eye to it, then who is going to make that right? We as followers of Jesus should be the first ones to make those things that are wrong into right. If not us, then who? Or if we just kind of kick it down the road, kick the can down the road, we'll get to it sometime. Well, if not now, then when? What would happen if we started answering that question? If not us, then who? If not now, then when? Father, my prayer is that we would be a church that answers those two questions. If not us, then who? Let it be us. If not now, then when? Let it be now. And when we step into these injustices, when we step into these pathways that are done wrongly, may we bring kindness, may we bring hope to them, and do that which is right. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.